Hey, congrats, man.
Thanks for coming by.
Look at all this fucking bullshit.
Yes, very serious.
Love you, brother.
Now, admittedly, I was extremely late to the Succession hype. I'd heard of the show in passing whilst just mindlessly doom scrolling through TikTok and Twitter. I'd seen out of context clips of what, on first impression, appeared to be just an incredibly boring, visually uninspiring show about rich white people doing business. My intention to watch this show that people were dubbing a quote-unquote cultural milestone by the time it was reaching its climax was virtually non-existent. However, and by pure chance, I stumbled across the fact that a minor character named Stefan Strauss appears in an episode. Now that's a name that means very little to most people. Unless you're a fan of Peep Show, my favourite and, in my opinion, the greatest sitcom ever created. It wasn't long after this that I discovered that Succession comes from the mind of Jesse Armstrong, one of the co-creators of Peep Show. Going into Succession with this knowledge, I had but a few expectations being familiar with his writing style. One was that this show was very likely to contain some morally reprehensible characters to whom I'd nonetheless develop a paradoxical fondness for. Two, that this was going to be fucking bleak. And three, and most importantly in my opinion, tragedy was going to be central to our characters' arcs and eventual fates. If you've ever seen Peep Show, and if you haven't, I strongly suggest you do, you'll know that these themes are central to the comedy, secondhand embarrassment, and tragedy of the show. Peep Show's co-creator, along with Jesse Armstrong, Sam Bain, described Peep Show as a, quote, realistic portrayal of why ordinary people are evil. I'd agree that this is a pretty accurate way to describe the show. Peep Show, through a more overtly comedic lens than Succession of course, explores loneliness, existential dread, failure, and repressed trauma. In my opinion, Succession doubles down on those themes, mapping them onto people so far removed from the ordinary person. Instead of their questionable moral decisions leaving them just alone, like in Peep Show, they get fascists elected to the highest office in the land. If you're listening to this, I'm gonna assume that you're caught up with Succession, so I won't bother with a thorough recap of its 4 amazing seasons. You'll be familiar with its core characters constantly jostling for power, doing and saying virtually anything so long as it benefits their personal ambition. This model to varying extents applies to most of our core characters, whether it be the likes of Cousin Greg, Hugo, Jerry, or Mr. Tom Wamsgams. But central to the conflict, power moves, and ultimate tragedy are of course Kendall, Roman, and Shiv Roy. Our 3 kind of protagonists spend much of the show desperately longing for their father's approval, Mr. Logan Roy, who's the patriarch and head of Waystar Royco. Whether it's Kendall's constant attempts to appear imposing and powerful, Shiv's naive and paper-thin facade of intellectual hubris, or Roman's desire to merely be taken seriously as a business person, it's clear that these are desperately sad and hollow people with severe daddy and mummy issues. Roman most obviously. And in true Shakespearean tragic fashion, their core traits contribute significantly to their eventual failure of maintaining control of the company by the show's end. Shiv ultimately has the deciding vote, and she physically cannot stomach the thought of her older, more entitled brother taking control of the company. It's the corporate equivalent of a child breaking their own toy just so that their bullying sibling can't play with it anymore. Shiv's betrayal, if you can call it that, should come as no surprise to anyone in my opinion. Time and time again, Succession has shown Shiv to be a person that is willing to abandon all of her core values and principles just for her own gain, or even more pathetically, just to win. Throughout the first season, Shiv makes it clear that she is a quote-unquote liberal, not being afraid to confront her father about his toxic politics and the rhetoric his news organization spews out to the nation. However, the second Shiv is presented with the idea that she could possibly become CEO at the start of season 2, she is more than willing to become completely complicit and sometimes actively contribute to the poison that ATN is distributing. Shiv's fiance and eventual husband Tom ends up as the CEO, not because of his aptitude, hard work or experience, merely because he's the one willing to eat the most shit for Matsson. Shiv inadvertently provides the most glowing of CVs for Tom when describing him to Matsson. Shiv's arrogance with Matsson leads to her own downfall, and she makes sure to take Kendall down with her. Tom and Shiv's final moments in the car at the end of the show quite beautifully mirror some of her moments with Logan. And to me, it confirms that all of Shiv's worst nightmares have come true. Shiv has become her own mother, sticking beside the man in charge of the ludicrously wealthy and toxic company to rubber stamp her own status. A relationship devoid of love, trust, honesty, and hope. A relationship that spawned the kind of children the Roy kids have turned out to be. Those scars that we saw on Logan's back in Austerlitz in season 1 have been passed down to his children. And now that Shiv has essentially taken on the role of her own mother, the tragic implication to me is that the scars she has will be passed down to her children. A couple of episodes prior, when Tom tells Shiv that she wouldn't make a good mother, it didn't just hurt Shiv because it's a horrible fucking thing to say to your own wife. I think it hurt her because she believed it. What makes Shiv's ending so bleak to me is her self-awareness. She knows she doesn't really love Tom, she knows she doesn't want to be her mother, and she perhaps believes that she wouldn't make a good mother like Tom suggested. Despite all of this, her seemingly innate and uncontrollable lust for power and status trumps all of this knowledge, enough so that she's willing to settle for a life of unhappiness just so people know how powerful she is. Now, it is really important to note that Shiv and Succession itself is aware that we live in a disgustingly sexist world where women are forced to be extraordinary just to be perceived as good enough. Shiv may or may not be the best person to wield control of Waystar, but ultimately, because she is a woman, her aptitude or lack thereof is irrelevant to the way the outside world views her. As Kendall says in season 3, the quote-unquote market thinks that Shiv is too divisive and is a token snowflake woman. Whatever you may think of Shiv as a person or as a businesswoman, the idea that she can't handle the heat is an absurd claim to make. Roman is the sibling who was sending unsolicited dick pics to his colleagues. Kendall is the sibling who launched multiple attempted coups against his father and his company. However, the market, which is just a euphemism for the men in charge, still deems Shiv the riskiest option for CEO. Shiv is probably the most ruthless of the siblings, yet even she is pushed to the side by her brothers and her father. Shiv is pushed into the role of the nurturing, supportive woman, standing to the side of her brothers, which is a role that clearly does not come naturally to her. And to me, the idea that she is forced into accepting this role of the afterthought, of the bystander, by virtue of the fact that she is a woman in business, is soul-crushing, but an unfortunately all too realistic portrayal of how women are treated in the workplace. Since Logan's death in Connor's wedding, Roman has been unable to fathom a world where his father doesn't exist. As usual, throughout the season, Roman attempts to underplay his trauma and grief by looking at the world through the lens of deadpan, vulgar humour. However, his father was always there to chastise and belittle him, a dynamic that the show has suggested is continued from his childhood. Now, not so subtly, Succession has shown us that Roman finds pleasure and comfort in humiliation. It's all he's known, passed down to him from his clearly abusive father. And with his bizarre relationship with Jerry dissolving by the show's end, he has nowhere to receive this twisted gratification from. This comes to a head in the show's penultimate episode, Church and State. It opens with Roman reciting the perfect eulogy for his father, fully assured in its awesomeness. We cut to later in the day and Roman is attempting to deliver his speech at Logan's funeral, and that's where the stark reality finally sets in for him. His father is dead, and he is laying a few meters away from him in a wooden box ready to slowly decay. Roman has quite a public breakdown in tears, and can barely get through the first few syllables of his speech before he's ushered off stage by his siblings. In an attempt to restore some sort of normality as Roman knows it, which is experiencing pain and humiliation, he willingly enters the neighbouring riot, waiting to just be physically injured. It's in this state that we find Roman in the final episode, regress to the battered and bruised, figuratively and literally, little boy he once was, attempting to find some comfort from his mother. Shiv and Kendall reunite with Roman, where he is convinced to get behind Kendall as the sole CEO of Waystar in order to win control of the company from Matsson. For a brief period in time, the three are at peace with each other and with the decision they've taken together. Roman is injected with some life, perhaps with the uncertainty of who will take over as CEO finally alleviated. That pressure to prove himself, to be taken seriously, is maybe gone. But it's in the moments before and after the all-important board meeting where we really learn Roman's fate. And more importantly, we get some of the most telling information about his relationship with abuse and humiliation. As Roman begins to spiral prior to the meeting, having a breakdown and questioning why it couldn't have been him in relation to the CEO position, Kendall hugs him tightly, so tightly that his stitches pop open and cause him to continue his bleeding. Now, as to why Kendall does this or why Roman would want this is left pretty ambiguous. Some have suggested that this is Kendall attempting to prove to himself and to Roman that he can be just like Logan, a ruthless killer who's able to keep Roman under his thumb and keep him in line. Others have suggested that because Kendall is aware of Roman's twisted relationship with humiliation, he gives Roman a reason to keep up a facade with the other members of the board. My personal view is that this is Kendall's way of showing Roman the only type of love he knows, humiliation and abuse, the type of twisted affection shown to Roman by Logan throughout his life. It puts Roman back in his place, while simultaneously allowing Kendall to believe the lie he's told himself that he is as ruthless and good at business as Logan was. A belief that is shattered in a few short minutes, with Shiv eventually refusing to accept Kendall as the CEO. It's at this point where Roman drops the nuclear bomb that I believe fulfills his two greatest desires at the same time. Roman abrasively tells Kendall that Shiv's unborn child would continue the bloodline of Waystar, as Logan didn't see Kendall's children as legitimate. Kendall physically attacks Roman in a fit of rage, ultimately pushing Shiv over the line to convince her that there's no way she can stomach Kendall as the CEO. In this instance, Roman achieves two things. It clearly fulfills his masochistic fantasies, but with this being the final nail in the coffin for the Roys maintaining control of the company, he frees himself from the cage he once said he was in at the very start of the show. To me, this scene beautifully mirrors Roman's introduction as a character in the first episode, where in the very same building, with a smile on his face, he says, "Look at all of this bullshit." In the finale, after the argument, he says to Kendall that this is all bullshit, that he's bullshit, Shiv is bullshit, and he is telling Kendall because he knows it to be true. And for all of Roman's downright awful actions as a human being, the one thing we know he is not is a liar. He does know this is bullshit, and he's known it from the beginning. Only now, without the presence of Logan to appease and pretend for, he's able to be sincere in his declaration of bullshit. After the vote, Roman sits by himself at a bar with a solemn but content smile on his face, knowing that he's freed himself from that cage he felt his father put him in. The tragedy to me is that to get to this point of enlightenment, he has had to inflict irreversible damage to his familial relationships and ultimately himself. And so we come to the number one boy, Mr. Kendall Roy, the character most fragile, most insecure, and with the most to prove to himself. Although Succession has a large ensemble cast with countless standout performances, if you could describe anyone as its central protagonist, it would of course be Kendall. The show starts and ends with him, and to a certain degree, its emotional core centers on his relationship with Logan. In the run-up to the series finale, Jeremy Strong described the show as a, quote, love story between Logan and Kendall. He's like the sun I've been orbiting my whole life, and I want his light to shine on me, but also if I get too close, it will burn me. Now, I think that this is a pretty accurate description of Kendall and Logan's relationship, and with Logan having passed away by the show's conclusion, his stranglehold on Kendall only grows stronger and stronger. Like the sun, Logan's gravitational pull is impossible to escape. Kendall, who was promised the role of CEO by his father from the age of 7, has been slowly heading towards an inescapable fate. Throughout the run of Succession, Kendall has been slowly burning, becoming more tense, irritable, and impatient until he reaches an ultimate breaking point. Kendall has convinced himself his entire life that his destiny and his sole purpose in life is to succeed his father from the moment that role was promised to him as a child. Any other reality is inconceivable to him. Eventually, what brings him down is his own arrogance and sense of entitlement. Like he says to Shiv, if he doesn't get to do this, he feels like he might die. There is one brief moment where, prior to the final board meeting, he sits in Logan's chair and casually rests his feet on the desk. We see the look of disapproval on Shiv's face, the moment where their carefully laid plans for control of the company make way for adolescent sibling rivalry. Once the three siblings are alone together, we see Kendall at one of his lowest and most destructive points. The moment that gets to me, personally, is Kendall claiming to lie about not being involved in Andrew Dodd's death, who was the waiter who was killed at the end of season 1, which is merely a manipulation tactic to get Shiv to vote for him. If you cast your minds back to the finale of season 3, it showed us Kendall finally confessing what he had done to his siblings in a moment of emotional vulnerability that had been in the making for 2 seasons. This unity between the siblings ultimately brought them close together, and in a pretty twisted way, helped rally them into attempting and failing pretty quickly to overthrow Logan. The fact that Kendall is now willing to negate this rare moment of strength with his siblings for a shot at a job is truly tragic. In these moments, we receive concrete evidence that Kendall is not built for this role like his father was. The Logan that he and his siblings know would never crumble like this under pressure. Albeit he would emotionally abuse and manipulate anyone around him, he wouldn't crumble. And that crumble isn't out of nowhere. Kendall has crumbled under the weight of expectation and sense of failure instilled in him by Logan himself, that pressure to one day be him. What I think marks Succession as the ultimate tragedy, especially for Kendall, is that he fails to realize that he has become Logan, just without his role as CEO. What is Kendall left with at the end of Succession? He's left with strained relationship with all of his family members, an ex-wife who resents him, doesn't trust him, and with no friends. In the opening episode of season 4, which is one of my favourite scenes in the whole show, we see Logan out for dinner with his trusted security guard Colin, where he tries to convince him that he is his best pal. Both parties, without speaking a single word, knowing full well that Colin would not be associated with Logan at all if this wasn't just a job for him. In the final moments of the show, where Kendall goes for one of his trademark water-based brooding sessions, he is accompanied by Colin, whom he had essentially begged to come and work for him. Kendall is Logan in every way possible except the two ways he wanted to be. Kendall wanted to be CEO and he wanted to be ruthless, but he is neither. He is now left with the burden of emptiness and loneliness, without the superficial fruits of labour he had imagined was the meaning to his entire existence. When we reflect over Kendall's journey, there seems to be so many points in time where his journey may have differed, with an ending where he finds some semblance of peace and happiness. If only he hadn't got in that car with Andrew Dobbs. If only he'd accepted a buyout earlier. If only he'd made it work with Naomi. But all roads lead to this ending. And ultimately, it may be the ending that Kendall deserves, an ending he could not have avoided in the most tragic way possible. Now, I'm of the opinion that Kendall isn't necessarily a bad person, at least at the bare minimum, a better person than his father. But being anything close to a good person is not what you need to succeed in this cutthroat world of media conglomerates. In fact, it can hinder your success. The difference between Logan and Kendall is simply that. I think Kendall has a conscience and feels unimaginable guilt for the bad things he's done in life. Logan did not. And yet, Kendall is the one who's destined to feel unworthy forever. The simple answer to this question would be Tom, the man who has unashamedly been looking out for his own self-interest since day one. He ends up in the role that his wife was desperate to have. Of course, we know that Tom's position as CEO may as well be ceremonial. Matt had explicitly said he needed an American CEO willing to eat as much shit as possible for him. Enter Tom Wamsgams, shit eater extraordinaire. It's a hollow victory, if you can even call it a victory. What it does is set Tom and Shiv up for a marriage doomed to end up just like Logan and Caroline, full of resentment and emptiness. As for Shiv herself, she doesn't get the role she feels most equipped to do, and ends up slowly morphing into her own mother, one of her worst fears. Kendall has to be at the bottom of this list simply for his never-ending internal struggle. He is alone, his relationships are irreversibly damaged, and now doesn't even have the dangling carrot of possibly being CEO to propel him forward. In my opinion, the only main character who leaves this situation with some sense of relief and optimism is Roman. The tragedy for him is that there's no way he would have reached this epiphany whilst Logan was still alive. It should come to no surprise either. Throughout the show, although Roman did show signs of surprising competency, it was all too easy to see that this world was not his, and he didn't want to be there. The only thing keeping him there was his desperation for Logan's approval, at the expense of his own happiness and well-being. That final shot of Roman says so much to me. He has accepted that he is bullshit, and he is relieved that the jostling for power with his siblings is finally over. Whilst his search for meaning post-Waystar may only be beginning, he is free of the one thing in this world he knew only brought him pain. He is now in a position to properly grieve the death of Logan and find some sort of purpose in his life removed from the toxicity of the Roy family conglomerate.